Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this seminar where we will be discussing a recent publication by the expert group for aid studies, Practicing Peacebuilding Principles, a study of Sweden's engagement in fragile and conflict-affected states. My name is Magnus Lindell. I'm a member of the expert group and I will be moderating our discussion today. With me on stage I have Jenny Lilja, who will present the report in a moment. We also have three distinguished discussants and panelists. Two of them are in the room, Karl from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Anders Frankenberg from SIDA. And joining us online from Washington is Claire Lockhart. Good morning, Claire. I will introduce all four of you a bit more properly later. But before we go into the business of the report, we will have a short video presentation of the expert group so that we are all on the same page on what we do and why.
Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida.
Now it's time to turn to today's subject. And back in 2011, the international donor community, together with a group of states defined as fragile or conflict-ridden, signed the New Deal for engagement in fragile states. That agreement was part of the wider process of aid effectiveness in which harmonization and alignment with countries' own systems were key. Domestic ownership of the development process was to be strengthened, which in the case of fragile states first required an increased focus on peace and state building. As a donor, Sweden had been a driving force in the aid effectiveness process, as well as in the process leading up to the New Deal. In 2016, a conference was organized here in Stockholm with the purpose of injecting new energy into the support for fragile states. The Stockholm Declaration, as it was called, updated the objectives and principles for this engagement. Now, a decade after signing the New Deal, the question arose as to what happened to its implementation. So we decided to commission a study to find out how Sweden has applied the internationally agreed principles in its own work. It is our hope that the lessons from this inquiry will benefit actors within the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, SIDA, the FBA and the Swedish security forces working with fragile states. The insights gained may hopefully also be relevant for the wider donor community as well as for domestic actors in fragile states. The study has been carried out by a team from CIPRI and FCG Sweden consisting of Gary Milante, Jenny Lilja, Joops Kluskens and Johanna Lindström. We are fortunate to have Jenny here with us. Jenny is the Director of Studies, Peace and Development Research at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Until recently, she served as a Senior Fragility Specialist with the World Bank's Fragility Conflict Violence Group. Prior to joining the World Bank, she was a Swedish diplomat and researcher with the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. Jenny, we are looking forward to hearing your presentation. The word is yours.
Thanks a lot, Magnus, and I'm thrilled to be presenting findings of this EBA study on behalf of my team of co-authors, Dr. Jeremy Lante, Johanna Lindström, and Joops Kliskens. So, as Magnus said, this study is about Sweden's application of the so-called New Deal principles in fragile and conflict-affected states. And throughout this process, we have received excellent input from our reference group and from many respondents, some of whom are sitting here in this room today. And our ambition from the start has been forward-looking. What can we learn from Sweden's experience? And when we talk about Sweden in this study, we talk about this broader set of actors: the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, SIDA, Folke Bernadotte Academy, and other Swedish government agencies that together constitute what is sometimes referred to as Team Sweden. So, what are these principles and why should we care about them? Let's go back to the millennium and the view of how external engagement in conflict-affected states was supposed to be. It was a largely linear view that said that during active conflict, the aid response would be primarily humanitarian in nature. Hopefully, there would be some peace process going on that would result in a peace settlement, and then we would get into a post-conflict phase where development aid would be used to promote resilience, post-war reconstruction. Very linear sense of progress towards sustained peace. But the problem was that reality didn't behave that way, and conflicts turned out to be more protracted than expected, and countries seemed to be stuck in these traps of fragility and conflict. This spurred reflections about how to use development aid more strategically to help countries exit these conflict traps. So, as Magnus said, one can say that the New Deal was officially born in Busan in 2011. And this was a mutual agreement between donors on the one hand and recipient countries that self-identified as fragile and conflict affected. There was also a third component to this, civil society. But the idea was really to have these mutual principled commitments from both donors and recipients. And these commitments that were made could be seen as a continuation of other principles that had been agreed previously in the context of the Paris Agreement framework of 2007. And as Magnus also mentioned, after Busan, countries met here in Stockholm in 2016 and agreed on additional principles. To put this very crudely, it was about bringing together development and politics, a more political approach to development in these conflict-affected settings. And this could be seen, for instance, in the peace-building and state-building commitments that the recipient countries agreed to. As you can see, it revolved around inclusive politics, about reforming justice institutions on the one hand, but donors also committed to engaging in joint fragility assessments, in building up and using country systems, and so forth. So if you start adding up all these individual principles, you get to a total of 44. And the issue here is that there is no objective metrics to actually measure or track progress. So in order to examine the application of these principles, we basically clustered these 44 principles onto 4 areas. The first area being context analysis. The second area revolving around coherence, both within Team Sweden and in relation to national and international counterparts. The third area was about promoting ownership and inclusion on the country recipient side. And the fourth area was about adaptation and changes in Swedish development cooperation to fit the context at hand. So we went on collecting empirical data, and as we analyzed it, we sometimes discovered gaps and went back to actually validate or collect new information. So we had this iterative process all along the way. And as you can see, our main focus here is on the country level. And we are zooming in on 5 countries that self-identified as fragile and conflict affected, and that were parties to this agreement in Busan. It was Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, Somalia, and South Sudan. And we also added a 6th country, Mali, as a comparator case to see if Sweden was working different in this setting compared to the others. We studied the time period from 2011 up to 2020. And our empirical sources are made up of 76 individual respondents. We made semi-structured interviews with 51, and we also had a survey going out. We used Swedish strategy documents, aid data, staffing data, and other independent studies and evaluations. And as data collection took place during COVID, unfortunately, we were not able to do any field visits, and this had an influence on the selection of respondents. We wished that we really could have had more national respondents, both from governments and from civil society. But even if we don't have this full representativity, we do have international and national counterparts from these countries, and we have done our best to triangulate so that we actually double-check information that we got from interviews with other sources. And if we then jump to the results, which we're all waiting to hear, it turns out that Sweden is, perhaps unsurprisingly, overall an appreciated actor, sometimes even referenced to as a model donor. The thing is that respondents tended to compare Sweden with other donors and not in relation to these principles that we're talking about. So we basically had to tweak our approach a little bit and compare not Sweden with other donors, but we compare Sweden with Sweden. And then we start getting an interesting variation across these different country contexts, where it seems like the application of the New Deal principles is the strongest in Somalia and in Liberia, and the least strong in South Sudan, and that Afghanistan, DRC, and Mali end up somewhere in between. So the question becomes then, what explains variation? And then we identify 3 sets of factors which can help do that. And we visualize these factors as cogs in a machinery. And the first factor or set of factors is about ownership by national counterparts. And it turns out that, for instance, in South Sudan, there was no clear counterpart, and we also found similar evidence in the DRC. As regards international partner coherence, the question then becomes, what are these other partners doing? Are they prioritizing these principles, or do they have other agendas? And then the third set of actors, which is about Swedish agency. And these parameters Sweden has more control over, evidently. And we decompose them into staffing-related factors, notably staffing in embassies in these countries, what they do and how they do it. And then we have a second subset of structural factors, which basically address the fact that no matter how talented and entrepreneurial and brilliant individual staff is, they will be limited or enabled by certain structural conditions. And as you can see with this sort of visual where we have these 3 cogs, we realize that they need to move. And if one cog is stuck or is absent altogether, there can be no overall traction for the New Deal principles, which really speaks to the fact that the New Deal is a collective endeavor. All right, so if we then deep dive into the staffing, what do we see? Well, in the countries with the strongest application, we see ambassadors and heads of development cooperation who really get it. And they're very proactive, they're jointly engaged, and they are backed up by the ministerial level. And they seem to be involved in these continuous rolling assessment processes of the situation, rather than sort of engaging in one-off written analysis on conflict and fragility. Importantly, they're also using the full range of instruments, from country-specific trust funds, which turned out to be very important, at least in the eyes of national respondents, for improving coherence, but also to build country systems. But not only that, it's about Swedish bilateral support, it's political dialogue, it's non-ODA support, notably to do with security sector reform. And it's about Sweden being able to work through and with the UN, with the IFIs and the EU. So we see evidence of very active coalition building between donors and national counterparts undertaken by these Swedish embassy staff, where they basically do what they can to promote joint analysis, shared priorities, and coherence in implementation. On the structural factors, as I mentioned, the space of maneuver for embassy staff will depend on certain conditions. And we highlight some of them here. We examine embassy staffing levels, and we examine also how much we do a theoretical construct, basically putting the aid levels next to the embassy staffing levels to get the measure of aid per capita. How much aid is one individual staff in an embassy, in theory, responsible for? Rotation rules, of course, will impact on the ability to form contextual understanding, and other incentives to get the right people to these hardship postings. One other factor that we highlight is the lack of a joint mechanism or framework for coherence at the country level. So Sweden is operating with different strategies, country-level strategies, thematic, multilateral, and humanitarian, that all come with different pots of money associated with them. And what turns out to be the case, particularly among Swedish respondents, is a perceived disconnect between development aid and humanitarian assistance in protracted crisis settings, where humanitarian aid high levels is basically a constant for, it could be more than a decade. There is also a perceived lack of non-ODA support, and this is again primarily Swedish respondents who highlight the usefulness of having security sector support as an entry point for dialogue around highly sensitive issues with national country counterparts. And if we then look more precisely at staffing numbers, and the reason why we were prompted to look at staffing data were comments that people made in interviews about the labor intensity of applying these New Deal principles on inclusion and use of country systems. A lot is demanded of staff in countries. So if we look at the staffing data, we see that the numbers of staff range from 1, which is the case the first year in South Sudan. It's not an embassy, it's a section office, but still, Sweden decided to have a country presence in South Sudan, up to the maximum amount of 14 staff in Somalia at the end of this period. And I want to point out that this staff is only staff devoted to development cooperation work or reporting. So it's not consular affairs, it's not sort of regular admin in that sense. And what we can see also is that if we look at the composition, we have the blue and the gray is basically international and local SIDA staff. We could categorize these as SIDA embassies with more than 70% of total staff time being represented by SIDA. The MFA makes up about 10% of staffing time, and in many cases it's only the ambassador that represents MFA in these embassies. We also see the trend of local staff increasing over time. So by 2020, more than a third of every office comprised local staff. And this was highlighted as very important for contextual understanding, but then we also see that this comes with major responsibilities when things go wrong, which we have been able to witness. There was also a last category of staff from other agencies. And the question you may pose then is this too much or is this too little? And as I mentioned, we can put sort of the staffing levels in relation to Swedish aid. And then we see that Afghanistan was really the top recipient, followed by Somalia. And we can go more into a discussion around these aid to staffing numbers perhaps later on. But it's one important way to sort of objectively capture the responsibility or burden, if you want to put it like that, on country staff in the field. So, going forward, we suggest that Sweden basically recommits its existing approach to promoting coherence in development in conflict-affected states. And we can call it a triple Nexus Plus policy, because it's not only about bringing together development, peace building, and humanitarian, but we need to add on the security component and basically do this to reflect ongoing ground realities and the protracted nature of humanitarian flows and Swedish security engagement in different settings. We would like to draw the attention to the country level and put that at the center and have Swedish multilateral work in the UN, New York, Geneva, Rome, but also IFI engagement and Swedish engagement in Brussels and Stockholm to enable peace building at the country level. And adequate embassy staffing is definitely one factor to have a look at, and ensuring that you have staff with the right profile who can promote the building of coalitions and who have dialogue skills and so forth. We would like to really highlight and make systematic this very close collaboration between ambassadors and heads of development cooperation that we could see in a number of countries that we studied. Focus on the country level. And we would then also suggest that we have an establishment of a peace-building focal point in Stockholm to basically have one point of support for embassies in conflict-affected states to serve as a repository for institutional memory, for knowledge support, for training. It could be populated by FBA experts. And one important function would be to decrease vulnerability that we see linked to staff rotation and disruptions in fragile settings. We also have another suggestion to condition Swedish multilateral core support to UN organizations, to IFIs, whereby they basically commit to engage in joint coherent efforts towards collective outcomes in conflict-affected and fragile states. And this would actually not be a new commitment, because many of these organizations have already signed up to it. It's a matter of translating that into practice and to follow up in an objective sense. And then we would also just generally encourage the promotion of coherence and complementarity with humanitarian actors, and having an EU engagement as well along the same lines. So to close, I'm posing a question that could be a segue to the rest of the discussion, which I'm looking forward to. But the overall question is whether the New Deal principles are dead. And I would say that several principles are still very much alive, and they're even internalized. So they're not associated with the New Deal, but when we talk about inclusion, local ownership, it's essentially some of the key building blocks of the New Deal. They have also been incorporated into other frameworks, such as the 2030 Agenda Goal 16. We can also see the triple nexus approach being a continuation of these New Deal efforts, where you basically add humanitarian engagement to development and peace building. And I guess that we will be discussing these frontline issues very soon. So I would basically hand over to you, Magnus.
Thank you very much, Janny, and thank you for condensing such a thick report into a very digestible format. I will now invite our first panelist to the podium, Karl Skau. Karl is Deputy Director General and Head of the Department for UN Policy, Conflict and Humanitarian Affairs at the MFA. Karl has a long experience in peace building from the UN and EU, both at the New York and Brussels level and from the field. Karl, welcome.
Thank you. Is this working now? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar. And thanks to the team who has been working on this evaluation. I think at the outset we said, let's not make this just another evaluation and looking back, but really come with concrete recommendations on how we can improve this work going forward. And I think you certainly has delivered on that. And I think your presentation today is something we really, take to heart and will be extremely useful. Also, how we build our capacity going forward. And let me come back to comment on that. I must admit that right now, all attention is on what's happening in Europe and around Ukraine, of course. And that includes for myself. It was hard even to squeeze away an hour, and I hope that in the next couple of weeks we will be out of this first frenzy, but it's clearly something that will be with us for a long time ahead. But I think what's important here is also that while understandably we focus on Ukraine now, and we'll have to do so going forward, is that we don't drop all these other balls. It will be important to have capacity and focus and resources on the other challenges that we had before Ukraine, whether it's climate, the pandemic, of course, that we are not out of, the increased inequalities and poverty that we've seen indirectly related to the pandemic, digitalization. I mean, the agenda, but of course also the crisis around the world that are not of the same nature that we have now in Europe, but really requires our attention. We have, just to give you an example, we are hosting an international donors conference on Yemen next week. There were actually questions whether we can do this in this environment, but we said we have to go forward and do that. It's hosted with the Secretary General and our ministers, because we need to also be able to do two things at the same time. But just to give you a context, that is very real now, the risk of Ukraine and the crisis in Europe pushing out attention and resources and the capacity on everything else, basically, and that includes this field. But more important than that we have this discussion today, also as a demonstration that we need to stay focused also on these internal conflicts and how we can better adapt our instruments on how to promote conclusion to those conflicts and those crises, which are mainly internal in nature. Just to make a couple of quick overall points. First is that the Secretary General has set out something he calls the common agenda, which is his big report and response to the UN 75 declaration that came last year. I don't know if you've heard about the report, but it has a section called New Agenda for Peace. This is very much the priority for the Secretary General in his second term. This new agenda for peace is rather empty, I must say. So it isn't really an agenda yet, but it has the potential that we contribute to fill that agenda. But what the Secretary General does set out as his kind of guiding principles for that is prevention, investing in prevention, and that we need a broad security concept. Really, talking the language that Sweden has done for years, and let's see how we can use that commitment and engagement by the Secretary General of the UN in the next couple of years to try to push that agenda forward. The second thing I wanted to raise here is that even before Afghanistan, but really triggered by Afghanistan, we are now reflecting on how do we do and work in context where frankly we don't want to strengthen national capacity, or at least not state capacity. And many of these principles that you referred to in terms of the New Deal was very much geared toward more kind of Somalia or Liberia context, where it was all about building that national capacity from something that has kind of broken down. If we talk about Afghanistan, we can't and don't want to legitimize and strengthen the Taliban regime. At the same time, we realize we cannot move over completely to humanitarian. So how do we find a formula where we can actually safeguard and maintain, at local level at least, or community level, state structures in health, education, in basic services? But the same goes now for a number of countries. I mean, we've been looking at this from a different point of view in Syria. That's politically extremely sensitive. Yemen is another case under the Houthi-controlled territories. Now we have Myanmar, another regime we can't work with, but at the same time, we can't move everything over in humanitarian. We're not going to be able to match those needs. And we have the Sahel with the coups both in Mali and Burkina. So we're moving into a territory where basically it will be impossible to let these countries crash for all kinds of reasons in terms of the human suffering, of course, but also terrorism, migration, what have you, piracy. But we cannot, work in the old logic of development in terms of legitimizing and strengthening and working through government. So, and here, frankly, this is the discussion in Washington, in Brussels, in New York, but no one sits with answers. We have launched a project with some think tanks to try to get some ideas on the table, both in terms of how to tap into resources, but also on how to find formulas at the country level. Certainly what's set up now in Afghanistan is not sustainable, nor is the approach in Yemen sustainable. But here, this is the crux of the matter right now. And so there might be need for kind of new, not principles maybe, but new elements for a framework on how to work on these contexts. Just to kind of move back to more concrete, we created the new UN department at the ministry about a year ago or 2 years ago, maybe now, where we brought together the humanitarian division with the UN development division, with the peace and security division. And the whole intention was to kind of create a nexus department, if you will, bringing the different aspects together. I think that has helped strengthen the coherence of what we do. But it's certainly difficult because no one else really is organized that well. So, I have always 2 or 3 counterparts, whether it's Brussels, Berlin, London, Washington. And so even if we do better internally, we are kind of torn apart about how the international architecture is looking. And frankly, it is hard to bring it all together also in terms of broad or bandwidth and ability to manage. But just to say that we, in a way, what you recommend around the hub, we have somewhat at an MFA level tried to create. And I think, frankly, there is also a lot of good work done in kind of a Team Sweden spirit with the SIDA, with Folke Bernadotte. I don't know how it was 10 years ago, but my impression is that things have really evolved and there is a lot of dialogue. We're working closely together, both in terms of our country level approach, but also vis-a-vis New York and other policy issues. And I think another thing I wanted to raise was the good Peacebuilding Financing initiative that we took about 1.5 years ago. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but it's an initiative to raise volumes going into peacebuilding, but also the quality of that funding being more flexible. And as part of that, also to make sure that the bank, the UN and other big actors work closer together. Maybe to just conclude, to comment on one of your concrete recommendations around the staffing at country level. I completely agree with you. I think that's where it begins and ends in a way. But it's a hard one to solve. It's, as you say, one is numbers. We have a government model in a way that hasn't allowed to invest as much resources in personnel as we all would have wished. We are trying to find creative solutions with FBA secondments and at least increasing the SIDA staff. But at the end of the day, from an MFA point of view, there is a clear limitation. Look at Mali, for example, where we have troops, about 1 billion Swedish crowns in investments in humanitarian and development. And I think we've not even had one political staff over the past couple of years. So just demonstrating that we are too thin from an MFA point of view. But it's not only numbers, it's also about the profile and capacity. And frankly here, we'll have to reflect ourselves as well. It's not... You need often people in order to be able to fully delegate and give the flexibility that would be needed to find local solutions. People with some experience. When I was 23, I first went with UNHCR to Colombia. Frankly, I had no clue what happened there. It was great for me because it built an experience that I needed when I then moved up working for an RC office and then into the MFA. So it was excellent for my personal development, but frankly, I had no contribution to the work of UNHCR in the field. And so it's not really that kind of people or profiles that will make a difference. And when I had built that experience 15 years down the road, I had 3 children. And frankly, I wasn't up for moving to Mogadishu or to, Kabul. And so just looking at my own kind of, and reflecting on that, it's not that easy. And how do you actually square that circle? I don't know, but certainly we need to reflect on that and build in the right incentive models to put more effort in getting the right profiles and the right numbers into these embassies. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karl, and thank you for reminding us about the new territory where development logic might need to be challenged. Our next panelist is Anders Frankenberg. He is presently head of Peace and Humanitarian Security Department at SIDA. He has a long experience of the issues we are discussing today, having headed SIDA's regional program for the Middle East and North Africa for a few years, and more recently as SIDA's head of cooperation in Myanmar, a country you mentioned, Karl. So, Anders, we are looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you, everyone, and thank you, Johnny, for a good presentation. And I want to start thanking you and your co-writers for a very relevant and interesting report. It rendered already a lot of discussions internally in SIDA, which is very good. And I think we have already had some communications directly to you also on specific country experience in Afghanistan and DRC. Where they actually think that we did a little better than come out of the report. But I think that's on the details. I really think that this is a good report and a very welcome report. I also remember 2011 when the New Deal for engagement in fragile states was signed, and we were several colleagues then that thought this was a good step forward to strengthen the ownership for development effectiveness in these countries with the focus on peace and state building. The 4 New Deal principles are not dead. I agree with you. They're very important and very relevant and alive and kicking. Maybe we're using a little bit of different wordings, but we are still on a continued road here. I think, as you said, we're moving forward on this one. And especially when it comes to understanding the context, making the analysis, the fragile analysis, which it was called before. Now we're talking more about conflict analysis, conflict sensitivity analysis, but also multidimensional poverty analysis. But stressing also the ownership and the inclusion. I think you're right in noting that the coherence is something that is evident in our work, but it is something that we need to work more on. And we would benefit from an overall policy or a framework. And I think we could definitely do more on that. And then a discussion I think we will move on to, but I will ask the question already now, but because I wrote it down and I think it's very important. In your document, you reflect on the DAC recommendations for humanitarian development and peace nexus, which was also mentioned by Karl and Magnus. I think they are something that we can build on, and I think we can move forward on that. And CEDA has already done that by developing our own guidelines for the triple nexus or the HDP nexus. And the reason why I say that is because that includes a lot of the similar recommendations as you're pointing out in your report. So I think we have something there, and I think Sweden, as a sign off to that recommendation, it's something that we can build on and build further on. Again, it's also in line with your recommendation on establishing a peace-building focal point or an ambassador. I think that's important because I think what we have now is a lack of steering on the highest level. We need a little more here in Stockholm, in headquarters, to work together. We have a good team of Sweden, as Karl was saying. I think the last 5 years it's really moved forward, also with the FBA in some of the embassies. We have staff in embassies, both CEDA, FBA and Minister of Foreign Affairs. We're working very closely together. But I think there is a good point of taking this forward by having both the framework and someone taking that responsibility. But I think you could emphasize more that FBA, CEDA and the Minister of Foreign Affairs should be part of that, because the knowledge that we have, considering the number of staff that CEDA actually have, we're ready to take on that, and we're already working on learning experience and having networks internally, and also inviting others to learn from our experience. Finally, as you're suggesting, more systematic promotion on the country level and collation with others. I think I'm on the same page as Karl here. It's about where we are now. Unfortunately, the willingness and the capacity of governments to prioritize and promote peace building or state building is lacking. And given the fact that we're actually moving to more and more authoritarian governments, is it actually possible or even advisable to work with the country systems and to support state building? In some countries, no. We need to look at different ways of working. Afghanistan, Myanmar was mentioned, and I saw also when I worked with Myanmar, it's of course humanitarian need is there, but we also need to continue to work with the people of the country and the civil society, the communities, and how do you build health and education systems in a country that is run by the military, which we don't want to use their systems. I think I stop there, and we will come back with more discussion points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders. And apparently there are quite a few issues that we can dig into later in the discussion. But first, I would like to introduce our third panelist, Claire Lockhart, joining us now from Washington, D.C. Claire is director and co-founder of the Institute for State Effectiveness, which works on governance issues, including research, tools, and practical country engagements. She is a frequent commentator and writer on issues of peace building, governance, and development. She is also a senior fellow at the Yale University. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'll start with congratulations to Sweden, the MFA, CEDA, the EBA, and the authors for this important study, and really commends Sweden for its leadership and focus on this challenge over the years. And in my experience, Sweden has been a leader in both the policy and practice, which puts you all, of course, in such a catalytic position for the future. It's clear that the premise for the importance of this issue still holds, and I would agree that the New Deal principles are very relevant for today. And as we look at the world today, joint action based on the right analysis, the right objectives, the right strategy and coherence much needed. It's also clear, as the study really honed in on, that there was an implementation gap between some of the intentions of the New Deal and the reality, and finding out why is important. Are we conducting the right analysis? Are we following the right strategies and instruments? And are there other instruments or ways of working that might close this implementation gap? And I'll come to later, the question of, are we now in a changed context where different approaches, complementary approaches, will be needed in some circumstances? Overall, what struck me from reading the report, which was well noted by the authors, was the importance of the role of security in the integrated approaches that are not always given the proper space or focus. And I think Sweden, again, is an important outlier in this, because Sweden does pay attention to how to integrate the security objective, the security instrument into the strategy. Commenting briefly on each element of the report in terms of context, I think the authors rightly noted that it's for assessments of context, joint and regular rather than sporadic and contracted out are important. And it seemed to me as well that analysis in general needs to be more historically informed. You know, what's been happening over the past, what's the present moment in a world that is rapidly changing, but also what are the opportunities in future. We know that we're now in a changed global context, and not least including in fragile states because of demographics, technology, climate, and now the new challenge of authoritarianism. On the topic of coherence, the report, I think, well noted the absolutely critical role that Sweden can play. And then, as Jenny Lilla started us with, perhaps the lack of an operational framework at the country level that can inform and support an integrated approach. And I'm reminded of the doctrine that was much more apparent in the 80s and 90s of IDAD, internal defense and development, where there was much more focus again on that operational integration and coordination in the country, at the country level. And I think the report authors have taken important strides towards that focus on and questioning, are we missing something in terms of that operational art? On the ownership, again, Sweden can be really commended for tackling the question of ownership through the lens of inclusion, and not least with the feminist foreign policy. And again, commended for continuing to put human rights and social development at the core of these issues, I think very rightly. And I think the report authors correctly noted sometimes the tension between ownership and inclusion. And then finally, on development cooperation, and the Deputy Minister has already noted, sending the best people to the most challenging contexts is really important, and the continued focus on that staffing. In terms of the recommendations, I think the question of a new capability is going to be crucial, and so the recommendations of having a new cadre of people would be an enormous stride forward. And then the importance of, if you're going to focus on the triple nexus, again, the importance of adding the security instrument. Finally, I'll just reflect on the changed global context, and as Karl set out, the importance of a broad approach to security. So within the context of the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, there's space to be filled in there. And again, the report takes us towards thinking through what that might look like. And then with this question of the type of fragile states we're now looking at, in many cases, there are governments that we do not want to empower. And I think this is where the New Deal has a lacuna, again, that needs to be filled. Are there a set of preconditions that are necessary before this approach can be used? And I think there are. And is there an open moment that would allow this kind of engagement? And then if not, what are the operational approaches and the national programs and the real importance of the community level and the community development approach that, again, Sweden's been so much part of? Over from me.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for highlighting the necessary operational integration at the local level and the country level, particularly also including the security sectors. Now, Jenny, it's only fair that you should be given the opportunity to sort of comment and reflect on the comments you've had. But we have an emergency in Ukraine, and that means that we need to rearrange this discussion a bit. Karl, you will have to leave us in a few minutes for some urgent Ukraine-related business. So I will allow you some parting words before you dash off, and then we continue the panel discussion here.
Thank
Karl.
you, and again, thank you for inviting us to this. And first of all, I have 3 points. The first of all, just again to thank you for the report, Gianni, and the team. We will certainly, see how we can incorporate this in our policy work going forward. Folks at the country level, I think we have, we are in that process. Conditioning our support to multilaterals for working together. Frankly, we are already doing that as well, and certainly promoting increased coherence as well is part of our GPF initiative. I think the issue of policy and the focal point, something we'll have to reflect on, how we can kind of tap those gaps, building on what we already have. But certainly we will indeed reflect on these recommendations and take them to us. Second, I should have also highlighted, of course, that we continue to prioritize climate and security and women, peace and security as our top thematic priorities. Those were our top priorities in our Security Council tenure. They were our top priorities during our OSCE chairmanship, and they will be our top priorities now for our EU presidency in 2023. And we are, of course, not, playing the same tape. We are always trying to update and see, how we operationalize going forward. And in both of these areas, there are, while the Women, Peace, Security agenda has come much further, there is now scope to take steps forward in terms of how to operationalize this even more at the country level and make sure that it is not only at the policy level, but also making a difference at the country level. My third point is on context, and there are 2 parts to this. First, on Ukraine. I think, we should avoid, mixing or trying to make Ukraine as a try to peg the work on peace building to Ukraine, saying that it is, look, we need to do more peace building. It's a completely different set of issue. And so rather than have the narrative is that we need to be able to do both. This is not the same thing. I think that would rather play into or risk playing into a Russian narrative that there are issues in Ukraine that needs to be resolved. So frankly, I'd be careful with that, but rather to have an argument that this we need to be able to do both. There is the Congo and there is the Ukraine, and for the Congo we need to continue working on peace building. The second is really this issue of I think you called it a gap or vacuum, Claire. We need to reflect on how do we deal with the fact that the modalities we've set up is really built around national ownership. And if we are now increasingly dealing with these fragile states where we have regimes that we don't want to empower, how do we do that? The modus now has been moving over to the humanitarian. That is not sustainable, nor effective, nor what's going to do the work. And so to find that formula, as I said, about how to tap into the big development money, but also how to find formulas at the country level to do this in a way that makes sense. That is an outstanding question and something we'll all need to come back to, and where the New Deal frankly doesn't have the answers. We need to be able to, that's a new policy space, if you will, where we need to come up with some elements of guidance in the next few months. And I hope that if not all attention is moving away from Afghanistan now, I hope that Afghanistan can help kind of draw the urgency to that issue. Again, thanks.
Thank you very much, Karl, and all the best for your next meeting. And
thank you. And I really appreciate being here. Sorry.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, Karl. Now, Gianni, after this various interventions, it's only fair that you have a chance to reflect a bit on what has been said.
Well, thanks a lot. And I could start in any direction, really, but to follow on to what Karl just said, I think the principles still stand. It's about unpacking them. What does country system mean? What does country ownership mean? And there are different interpretations here, but we should really focus on the practical translation of principles into practice. And so we don't need to ditch the principles, we just need to deepen and sort of go for more applied understanding of them. I very much agree. This is an awful time for conflict resolution in the world. Then I would guess that we should invest more in peace because of that. I take your comment there, Anders, to heart, that there is a need for a new framework that can link together different policy areas. And I also get the sense that whereas the New Deal was sort of sprung out of an aid effectiveness agenda, we need to expand beyond the development paradigm, as has been suggested. You know, we need to recognize the full range of instruments, going from political to security engagement. So it shouldn't be that we have the aid and we go around looking for sort of with our hammer looking for a suitable nail, but we should really take the context as a starting point and then see what instrument makes more sense here. And also, I mean, we all know that the Busan Agreement was crafted in a particular context, and after that we had the whole developments of the Arab Spring and basically low-income to medium-income countries being affected by conflict. And you know, it may not be the same types of solutions. It may not be aid primarily that is needed. It may be more sort of political engagement that will help advance the situation. I think I will basically concur with you, Anders, that it's good to discuss the sort of retake on coherence from a triple nexus perspective, but I don't think it's enough. So I think it's good that the discussion is being pursued with other players, given that, you know, whatever we do, we need to move in the same direction. So that's one platform, but we should not disregard or sort of silo ourselves unnecessarily by not engaging with security sector actors or with other instruments that we see are being used in the context of conflict today. But we can go more into sort of the ways forward in the next phase of the discussion.
Thank you, Jenny. And I saw Claire nodding vigorously when you talked about going beyond the development paradigm. We might return to that later. But before we go further into the program, I just want to give the audience a heads up that there will be an opportunity to ask questions or post comments. For those of us being here physically, that is fairly straightforward. There will be a mic walking around. For those of you participating through Zoom, you can post your questions or comments using the Q&A function, and Mats Horsmar from the EBA Secretariat will make sure that your comment is forwarded. I will now kick off the panel discussion here by turning to you, Claire. You and ISE have written a lot about how peace-building principles, including the New Deal, have been applied in practice among international donors. Widening our horizon a little then, what could you say are the main lessons or challenges or perhaps even obstacles over the last, say, 10 years? Claire.
Thank you. And this question comes at a time when the WTR 2011 is under the microscope of this Stability Forum at the World Bank. People have been looking back and asking, you know, what have we learned, where are we now, and where to go. And I think as we do look back over the last decade, the principles in the WTR, which of course was related to the New Deal of security, justice, and jobs, were the right ones. I think there are two perhaps real elements to add. One is the importance of the human dimension, and the issue of human capital and of people, and of putting people really at the center, which again I think Sweden has done, really came to the fore. As the leader of the G7 Plus reflected, we need to put this dimension of human capital really much more central to the thinking. And this chimes very much with the Secretary General's recent report of, the question of putting trust in institutions at the center. I think there have been a lot of gains as we look back over the last decade, and I think it's very important as well to look at the where have the right lessons been learned and incorporated? Where have there been innovations that might not have been even put on the table 10 years ago? And in that regard, it is in this work in partnerships, in the way that the UN and the World Bank can work together, in the way that humanitarian agencies and humanitarian principles can be incorporated together with development instruments, where a lot of the gains have been made. Another gain or innovation is the way that the Bank, the UN, and some of the bilaterals are working together on the issue of forced displacement and migration. So again, the many innovations, but I think as we've been discussing as well, many gaps, and it really is, as we've been discussing, on the question of the operational questions at the country level, and that's really where the focus needs to be. Two other comments. One is and especially in response to Karl's comments, of the challenge that we see now in a number of fragile states, conflict-affected states, where country ownership, or certainly national government ownership, is not possible or desirable. And this puts then, I think, a real focus on the community level and on the citizen level. And that's where the work on civil society is going to be crucial, and on the instrument that, again, Sweden's played a huge role in helping to develop, is the work on community development and ways of delivering basic services that don't rely on perhaps a more fragmented humanitarian approach, that can be coherent, can be scaled across a country's territory, but don't need to be embedded within a national government system. And I think that's the work before the international community in Afghanistan, and thinking that through. Afghanistan does have a set of national programs, a national health program, education program, and community development program. And if these programs can be restructured to be within the humanitarian system in Afghanistan, that will provide, I think, another potentially important case that builds on the experience, for example, in Yemen, in Zimbabwe, and other countries where international humanitarian and development actors have been able to arrive at an approach that doesn't see it shifting to a humanitarian approach that would be unsustainable in the long run. And again, I do think that that's where, as Yanni says, I think those can be consistent with New Deal principles, but are going to require a lot of smart thinking and practical work ahead in the countries concerned. Over from me.
Thank you very much, Claire. We had some problems with the connection in the first minutes of your presentation, but I think some of it came through, and at the last part you were clear and we could hear you. Anders and Jenny, any reflections from your part on what's just being said?
No, but again, I want to stress the need for unpacking. What do we mean by state building, or can we maybe enlarge it? Can we talk about society building? Because sustainability needs to be at the forefront. And we can't rely on external support forever. So it's about rethinking systems of delivery that can work over the long run. So I agree, there's a lot of need for maybe not innovation, but basically documenting existing innovation, and giving credit to that. And I also think that there are elements of the New Deal. We shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater here. There are elements that are still very much relevant, and it's about sort of the comprehensive approach and the coherence, and key that not every donor, do it on their own, but that we also, in taking on more policy areas beyond development as such, I think the one challenge ahead will be to find the right institutional spaces to do that. How do we how do we have a structured, continuous conversation with, say, security sector representatives, Do we need to create new spaces to do that? And also, the countries that would very much perhaps be interested or benefit from engaging in this dialogue that don't classify themselves as fragile, but still conflict affected, and they're interested in the practices of peace building. How can we involve them in a more structured way? Because I mean, now I know that UNDP will take over the institutional secretariat function for the international dialogue on peace building and state building. But I think you need to enlarge the conversation beyond the existing members of that constellation. So, I mean, I think, you know, keeping the country level in focus and the operational knowledge and know-how and innovation, I think, you know, everyone working on this is being pushed now to think out of the box, because clearly the current approaches do not deliver. We're seeing more unresolved conflicts. We're seeing a reverse in development, you know, everywhere. So yeah, it's a call to to creativity and action in a sense.
This triggers a follow-up question for me, and Anders, I will let you in a second. But because all of you have sort of stated the New Deal principles are not dead, yet you put that question in your very last slide, Jenny. Are they dead? And international principles sometimes have a very short shelf life, don't they? And Triple Nexus is now the new sheriff in town. Taking a critical perspective, and I'm putting this question to you first, Jenny. Taking a critical perspective, is the Triple Nexus a sufficient framework for peace building and state building in fragile settings?
I think it's a step in the right direction, and it's good that, you know, a larger number of donors are taking it in parallel. But it's not enough. I mean, we can see, if you remember that sort of chronology, sort of the evolving policy train, if you want to put it like that. But you know, it's also a reflection of sort of ground realities. So the New Deal was, you know, trying to address the problem of its time. At that point in time, it was largely a matter of, you know, poor conflict-affected states and you know, how we can deliver aid. Since then, reality has changed, and we need to sort of reflect that, of course. We have new problems, new types of problems to deal with. And I don't think we should unnecessarily limit the thematic scope and not, you know, invite the security sector representatives into the discussion. And I don't think we should limit the scope of the sort of countries to take part in this discussion either. I think it should be more open and inclusive in a sense.
Anders, if you please, and then we have Gary on the line. But Anders first, I saw you drew your breath.
Yes, thank you. No, but I totally agree with you that it's part of this evolution. It has moved from 2011 and a New Deal, and we have since then seen changes in different countries and in the world. And for me, the difference, I think, is if you read the DAC recommendations, they are much broader than you are explaining. They include the security. They include what we call the big P and the small p, the big Ps and the small p. The security sector is also included in that document. Because I even talked to the people that were part of writing it, they did not define peace smaller. We did in CEDA, but that's because we have our guiding documents for development, and for development it's the smaller P, it's building peace. But I totally agree, we need to have a broader discussion with the security sector here, but also in the context. And that is not necessarily easy. So that's a tricky part, and we need to do the analysis together, which is part of the logic that you're presenting, but also the logic of the HDP nexus. And making that joint analysis and joint planning and joint programming is the key. And the time is ticking. Yes.
I have a two finger on your intervention, Anders.
Yes.
Because the security sector was already part of the original New Deal setup. The problem was that we didn't follow through in practice. There was no representation in the New Deal in the IDPS meetings. So yes, it's all there. It's referenced in the documents. You know, you have that as an entry point, but we're not walking the talk.
Now, I am happy to announce that Gary Milante is with us online from San Francisco. He is also part of the evaluation team, and he wanted to come in on this particular question. Good morning, Gary.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I hope the audio is okay. If we have bandwidth issues, please alert me and I'll turn off the video and I can intervene by audio.
No, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Perfect, thanks. I just have a few comments and trying to bring together a couple of the points that have been made. First, to remind people that Sweden is a model donor. I mean, this was very real feedback that we got from many of the respondents, international and national counterparts who were reflecting on this. And so it is timely to have a reflection on both what has been done well as a model for other donors, but what can still be improved. So I'm very glad to hear that this is well received and that people are looking to this. Many developing countries, including the G7 plus representatives that we talked to, said that they were delighted that Sweden was undertaking this evaluation. So reflecting on this, and that it could be useful for other donors to do this in the future. So we hope that we've laid the groundwork for that to be done. I do think we want to differentiate when we're talking about the New Deal and whether it's dead or not. And I'm glad to hear that it's alive. I would think we want to differentiate between the international dialogue, which was the incarnation of the New Deal over the last 10 years, and the New Deal. So there may have been things that need to be fixed about the international dialogue. That's the institutional structure that facilitated the New Deal. And I hope that on further reflection with the new good peacebuilding financing frameworks and the DAC recommendations, that new structures will incorporate regional perspectives, new emerging donors, and start to address some of these issues with counterparts, the willingness of counterparts in the kinds of states that are being built in state building. And that brings me to this question, and I think the way to think about it, the way that I've at least been thinking about it and reflecting on this report, is that it's really a sequential question, right? First of all, do we have counterparts in country that are willing to work toward peace building and state building, the actual goals? Are these honest actors who are working through what we would call the peace building and state building goals and the focus and trust principles? Are those counterparts existent? And that kind of raises the question of the Yemen, the Myanmar, the Mali, Burkina, Afghanistan, Syria that were listed by the minister. Then there's still a second order question that's after that, which is, what is, for example, in this case, for you, what is Sweden's role in this environment? Can it actually be a change maker, or is it going to be kind of an auxiliary actor who's in support of another change maker? And I think Afghanistan raises that question as well. You have a unilateral, very large actor that's working independently of kind of the PSGs, the goals. And then the question for Sweden has to be, what is the role in that kind of environment? Is it just as a facilitator? Is it as a change maker? Is it as a lead? I think those questions will help you answer the question, who or what team is necessary in that environment? And that's where we get to this capability question. Another option, and I'm an economist, so I'm always going to talk about scarcity, but another option is to do more with less, is to do fewer countries, be selective, say this is where we can engage, this is how we can engage. We know what the constraints are that were referenced earlier, and we would like to know what we can do in those environments. And the last thing I'll point out, and I probably talked too long, but the last thing I'll point out is, as those DAC recommendations are incorporated, as any kind of new framework is built, please add metrics. How will we know success when we see it? Because the next team that does this review in 10 years, maybe it's us, maybe it's somebody else. We want something objective that we can point to and be able to say, this is how we know this was done, this is where it wasn't done. And I think you all want that too. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gary, for your perspectives, and thanks for joining us in this discussion. I will now turn over to you, Claire. You started saying something earlier on the triple nexus and security. Perhaps you could continue that for a few minutes, and then we will have questions from the floor.
Thank you. And I'll start by very much agreeing with Yanni Lila and with Gary, but that the triple nexus seems to be a step in the right direction, or a step along the evolution, and having those three actors together and being coherent is good, but we do need a more open system because it's not only those three. And there may be some other actors or other instruments, and it'll depend on the context. So again, a step in the right direction, useful but not sufficient. I think the second point is the one that I've made again, is then what's the how-to and what's the operationalization that's needed, not only in the capital cities, but in the specific country context. So again, the recommendations of this report to focus on that country level engagement remain really important. Then picking up on something that Gary said, it's really about the sequential question. And then in any particular context, what is the ground level conditions? Are the preconditions in place for the focus and trust principles to proceed? And then taking a much more longitudinal perspective in terms of, what's the prioritization and the sequencing. I think one of the problems with the comprehensive approach was that it could sometimes lead to thinking that everything is needed at once, whereas if you could take a much more sequential approach. Also, again, for Sweden, and again, building on Gary's excellent point, that when one looks at division of labours internationally for Sweden, is it to be present in the full range of fragile states, or again, would Sweden select a number of countries that are going to be important? And then finally, it does seem to be a time to, at least, if not to declare the New Deal dead, but certainly to re-examine the principles. It looks like reaffirming many of them, but thinking about what was missing, and this question of metrics, and arriving at a set of metrics that can be the basis for joint monitoring and reevaluation at stages along the way will be crucial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Mats, I think we might have questions online, and I will also see if there are any hands here. Yes, we have a hand. We have quite a few hands. So if you pose one of the questions that we have come.
I can start with the questions that have come online. First comment from Annelise Clausen, agreeing on this broader approach, but saying that there are more aspects to take into considerations. For instance, focus on criminal networks and capacities around that. But she also warns that don't be too overambitious and try to do everything at the same time. There are a couple of questions on relationships between development action, development cooperation, and relations to other partners, the other actors. One, Saif Omar, citing the experience from Somalia, which was good. And then the question is, what does the study say about cooperation with other actors in country context when it comes to peace building? What are the effects there? And variety on that question perhaps is from another source here. The report talks about Sweden drawing on deep contextual knowledge of the Swedish Committee on Afghanistan in that country. Can you say anything about the forms for this contextual knowledge sharing between the SCA committee and other Swedish actors? And I keep on asking here. Chloe Trikoff O'Farrell, as others, thanks for the presentations, etc. The need to support civil society is often at the heart of this discourse, but in practice, many governments, including donors, are concerned by the political risks and ramifications this may entail. In this framework, there remain many barriers and challenges to meaningfully support civil society, including providing the funds that they need. How do you think we can remove these barriers? What does Sweden need to do internally and on the global stage?
I suggest that in order to economize on time, I suggest that we take the questions from the floor. We had Henrik Hammargren, I think, wanted to put a question, and there I saw a few more hands back at the very back as well. And then I will let Jenny and Anders respond. Thank you.
Hello, Henrik Hammargren from the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, but I might be a bit partial in this, but I was also sort of part of developing this whole framework once upon a time. First of all, just a big thank you to the team that has written this. It's an extremely well-written report, I think, when it comes to the methodology. So Johanna, Jups, and Yanni, and Gary, hats off. Secondly, it's been a remarkable development within Sweden in this whole field. I started working at SIDA when there was a small department, 4 people, working on democracy, human rights, and peace. So there's been a huge development when you look at this, and that is well recognized. I think what is described here in the interaction between the MFA, between embassies, SIDA, Folke Bernadotte, is remarkable, and I think that needs to be understood. And that also involves engagement in the Peacebuilding Commission, for instance. So that is well noted. The thing here is to look forward. We're, as we speak, entering a new world disorder. We're all moved by this, we're all challenged by this, and we must understand what this brings about, because it changes everything. Not only, and there is a bit of a don't look up issue here, but not only by rethinking a world without the systems that we are used to when we talk about prevention and building peace, but also addressing climate change. So my main question here is really looking forward, and I think that this is the most important part of this, because yes, Sweden has become a model donor in many ways, and you point out a lot of relevant ways where Sweden can strengthen itself, but there's one I would question, and I would put a little bit of caution when it comes to the triple nexus. Please note that the 2 words human and rights do not feature in there. So is that the plus, or is the plus the other dimension that's been added? Because we often include it when it's suitable in development, but there is a huge risk, as we know, when we neglect human rights. So secondly, looking forward, how do we ensure that these principles can be maintained? Are they dead? I don't think they are. But we should also recognize that they became overcomplicated right from the very start. It was a very simple approach. It was 5 goals. It was an agreed country strategy. There was a financing strategy to that, and it was identifying the roles at local, national, regional, and global level. If we can keep it at that, perhaps we can keep it alive. But that requires a new take on this and integrating it into new frameworks.
Thank you. That was almost a punchline at the end on working forward. Now we have a question from the lady down there, and then a question at the very back. And then I think we will have to let the panel respond before we close the seminar. Please.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Amina. I'm a student, postgraduate student at Uppsala University. Thank you to the panelists, very insightful discussions. My question is, would the panelists reflect on what insights they have when it comes to the area of ownership and inclusion? How do you suggest Sweden as a donor works with fragmented national actors, which is often the case for, and I think the report acknowledges the complexity of such situations. I'm familiar with Somalia quite a bit, and I think on discussing the tensions here, you know, you touched on legitimizing certain types of regimes. Myanmar was mentioned, but looking at countries where you know, regression is an issue, and you know, spoilers for peace. How do you deal with that? And considering obviously there's no coherence internally. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Mats, in the very back, I think there was a final question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much for a very interesting panel. My name is Julius Kramer. I work for the UN in Somalia, and really appreciate the last point here, but also speaking in a private capacity. I've enjoyed this report, and I like the emphasis on coherence, and you know, much of this is oftentimes jargon in a policy setting. I think you're boiling into the sort of institutional implications of the lack of coherence. What I'm interested in is more in substance, you know, because understanding coherence, and you're talking about unpacking these the objectives or the peace building goals. In substance, what does incoherence mean? Okay, we're talking about coherence from an institutional perspective, but what are the sources of incoherence, and perhaps more importantly, the trade-offs? You know, I work in Somalia, and I get questions quite a lot about trade-offs between, and we're talking about bringing the security dimension into this whole equation, but trade-offs between security priorities, political and peace building. And I think the framing of this question is, you know, how do we advance peace building? But with the emergence of counterterrorism narratives, preventing and violent extremism that, you know, tend to sometimes stigmatize large parts of the population and perhaps undermine long-term peace building objectives, is this something that you've come across in your research? Over.
Thank you for very interesting questions, everyone. Now the panel of two persons have the very ungrateful task of trying to give very crisp answers to these very wide questions. But I hope you can give it a try and hopefully take turns between the questions. So Jani, you first, and then Anders, but please be very brief.
Thanks, and I wish we could open up the discussion, because there are also assets in this room who have answers, have served in these countries and played critical roles. But I will give it a shot initially. And I think that Annelise and Henrik, you touch on similar points. In other words, keep it simple. Don't get overambitious, because then, you know, you may not succeed. So I agree. There were basically too many principles around, and maybe we should, you know, focus efforts around some of them. And this also came out from the interviews. You know, when you actually want to practice the New Deal at the country setting, it's about selecting, you know, what are your focus areas going to be in a context where everything is needed and everything in theory is a priority. Question 2 about peace building effects. Then I just have to say that we draw a restricted scope around our study, so we're not looking at impacts, we're looking at the application and the practices of application. So that would be a great topic for a follow-on study. I think I will leave it to you, Anders, to elaborate on the practical forms of engagement between the Swedish Afghanistan Committee and Swedish agencies, and maybe also the significant Swedish support to civil society in conflict settings and outside of conflict settings, which is pretty impressive. But taking your point there, question from you, Henrik, on sort of what does the plus, triple nexus plus imply? Yes, you're right. I think it could mean a lot of things beyond security, human rights, because those are indicators of conflict risk. So. But then it's this trade-off, sort of how large do you want this agenda to be, and how sort of simple or sort of rule of thumbs approach do you want to have? I think these questions about Somalia by Amina and by the last person in the audience, I think that we will have to take that afterwards because we are constrained for time. Over to Anders.
Punchline.
Punchline, okay. So unfortunately, I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, but I do know that there has been very much a collaboration between the Afghanistan committee and the embassies and the civil society that is working in Afghanistan. On the civil society, Sweden has and SIDA has a lot of support through civil society organizations, not just through Swedish organization, also international organization. All the global strategies, including the peace strategy that I represent, supports bigger INGOs that are in their turn is supporting local organizations. So we are very much trying to work through the local level. Now, I wanted to say the last thing maybe is thinking and acting beyond the government and state institution is important, because the capacity lies within the communities and the civil society, and we will continue to do that, and we are doing that in many ways. And I think that combines with the message from Henrik and others. We need to simplify this, but we need to work with the people and for the people, and that's through the communities and civil society.
Thank you, Anders. And finally, Claire, you have also time for a short punchline from your perspective.
Thank you. I would agree very much with Annalisa and with Henrik Kammergren on the imperative to simplify. And as we look forward, and I think the question then on everybody's mind now is, what's the forward agenda from here? It sounds to me like the principles of the New Deal are as relevant as ever, but there's important work ahead to simplify and figure out together what are the right operational concepts and policy concepts to continue this important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for being very brief in your final punchline. Now, this seminar is now coming to a close. I would like to thank you all for listening and contributing to a very interesting discussion, which could have lasted very much longer. There is much energy in the room and much energy in these questions. A particular thank you to you, Jenny, for sharing and presenting the report. Also thank to you, Gary, for chipping in. And many thanks to our panel, Claire and Anders, and also Karl, who has left us. I'd like to encourage everyone to visit our website, eba.se, where you can download reports and register for seminars and what have you. There is actually a seminar already next week, on the 23rd of March. We'll be discussing a new, very fresh study from the expert group on an evaluation of Sweden's strategy for information and communication. That was all for now, and thank you for listening, and bye for now.